Take a look at that. It's got two heads on it, a jet and a shower. The fourth cabinet that we have to build is the one for my sink, and it's going to be going right here next to the door. I've spaced the bottom out enough to have 3 jerry cans, 1 for grey water and 2 for fresh. The only thing that's a little awkward about this cabinet is this little offcut of the wall here. I'm going to be using this little exposed bit of the wall to anchor the cabinet down. So we'll get this sitting in there tight, and then we'll find a really solid way to anchor that in. That should give it a little bit more room to play. Now we just have to get this back piece lined up with the curve of the wall, and then we can mark the screw line on the other 2 boards. Alright, that's how I'm fixing this in. Just marking the angle that I want that back piece to sit on. It is all ready to go, so the first step is going to be fixing that into the van so we can begin fitting the sink. Here we have the sink cabinet ready to be installed, and to do this, I'm planning on using the last little bit of wall that we have available as the main fixing point. Through the back panel here, I'm going to be coming from behind and putting 2 bolts in that top section. So by using that as my main fixing point and putting a ton of screws through the floor, I'm hoping that should lock it in tight. So first thing for me to do is going to be installing these bolts behind the cabinet, and we'll see how that's holding. To mark the location that we're going to be drawing the bolts in, I'm just going to coat the end of this bolt in some black texture, and then when we push that through the hole that we've already got here, that should leave a mark for us to drill on the back of the cabinet. That's actually worked pretty well. You can see I've got 2 clear marks where I'm going to drill those holes. Alright, there we go. So we've lined the bottom with 12 screws to fix it into the floor, and then with those 2 bolts in the side there, that should be pretty solid. Alright, we'll call that a night and begin working on the plumbing tomorrow. Today what's exciting is my sink has finally arrived. It is a black granite sink, a little bit heavy, but I think it's absolutely beautiful. Here we go. Take a look at that. This sink was around 200 bucks on Amazon, which I'm more than happy to pay. It's granite, like I said. Super solid, scratch resistance. I think it's gonna make a really nice feature in the van. Hey, it actually fits. That's nice. I always like it when things work out. The sink is gonna sit in the middle of this cabinet here, and I'd like it flush mounted so we can run the bench top over the top and have a little cutout that comes out and still use the bench space when we're not using the sink. So I'm gonna play around with this design a little bit and come back once I know exactly how this is gonna come together. I've also picked up the 22 litre jerry cans that we'll be using for fresh and grey water. With the sink cabinet fixed in, we're going to be working on the bench top to match our kitchen bench top. So I've gone out and bought an identical piece of Hevia, and with this piece here, we'll have enough to do our bench top, our little pop-out table, as well as our centre table slash bed at the end. Now, just before we start sanding our bench tops, I have to make one final cut, and that's going to be the cavity for my sink. So now to mark out the cavity for my sink, I've gone ahead and traced on the underside of the piece where the supports for my cabinets are, because I want to fit as much of the sink in between that space as possible. So our next step is to measure the furthest out points on the underside of the sink, add 5mm for fit, and then that's going to give me my square template to cut out on the actual piece. So on the underside, we've got 465 by 415. So I'm going to measure that out, do some quick maths to get that as central in the piece as possible, and then we'll mark it all out. The markings are a little bit chaotic, but we've got the cutout piece I want right in the middle here. I'm planning on reusing this cutout as a lid for the sink, so we're gonna have to be very careful cutting this out, that we keep the lines neat so that when it gets installed again, the insert looks tidy. My usual method for taking out an insert would be to drill holes in the 4 corners and then just use my jigsaw between them all and tidy it up at the end. However, because we're keeping this piece, I think I'm gonna have to try with the multi-tool just to get that line down before we get the jigsaw blade in. Now I've got that piece cut out. There we go. I'm willing to call that success. Now, if I was very smart, I probably would have cut from the top down, because as you can see, with the thickness of the piece and the blade and the jigsaw, even though the line was straight from the front, the angle gets a bit funny and we've got a very wavy piece there. However, I'm not too worried because we'll be able to shade that down with the sander, make sure it fits nicely. All right, there we go. That's gonna work quite nice. So for this lid here, I want to try to get it flush mounted with the top of the sink. So I think the first thing we're going to do is take the underside and cut back from the top on a 45-degree angle just so it tapers in. Then that can sit down inside. Then we'll measure the outside and trim it to the right size so that it sits in there nice and tight. So we now have that piece tapered off at the bottom, and that's come out honestly way better than I expected that to. The next step is going to be getting all these lines straight and cutting it to the right size inside the sink. Now, instead of marking around the outside and cutting straight, I've measured the difference between the lip of the sink and how big my piece is. I'm taking that off the underside and we're gonna redo those angle cuts. We now have my lid sitting in there pretty snug. I've cut this piece to size with 45-degree angles on the back, and then to lock it in, I've taken little notches out of all the corners which sit comfortably on the edges there. That gets it to fit in there nice and snug without wanting to rattle around. So the next step before we can finish this piece off is going to be putting the holes in this so we can remove it. You've basically got two options for this. I've seen a lot of people opt for like one big hole in the middle, but personally I think it looks a bit neater if you have the two. So I'm running with a slightly smaller sized hole saw. We're gonna mark this out so we get them lined up perfectly symmetrical, and then we're gonna drill those holes in. With that done, we can now go ahead and start sanding all of our pieces ready to be stained. I've got all my pieces laid out, so we're gonna be working down with an orbital sander from 80 grit to 120 grit, and then finishing off with 240. And that should have everything nice and smooth, ready for our clear coat to go on. I have all my pieces sanded down, so now it's time to begin staining them all. To do this, I'm using Cabot's Campervan Clear in a satin finish, and because all of these are gonna be bench tops or tables that are gonna cop a bit of a beating over time, we're gonna be doing 5 thick coats on the top and sides and 3 coats underneath. My sink bench top is all dry, so we are finally ready to install that one. Now, before we lock that one down, I just have to notch out the area the sink's gonna sit inside the support brackets. We're now ready to mount my sink bench top to the cabinet, and to do this, we're just gonna be using screws to the underside of the bench top through the support beams that I built into it. Let's get mounting. That's all done now, so we can go ahead and run our silicone and get this sink fixed in. The sink's now got a layer of silica underneath that we need to set. So to lock it in place, I'm going to be using a clamp through the middle as well as some blocks on top. To give the sink a bit of pressure down while it dries, I've just built a little jig on either side. I've got 2 bits of timber sitting below the sink, and then underneath it we have a cross beam that's not touching, and then the clamp has gone through the hole onto the top just to lock it down while that dries. So we'll let that sit for the rest of the day, and when we pull that apart, that sink is not going anywhere. So while the silicone around my sink sets, we're going to look at installing the tap. Now this right here is the beautiful matte black tap I've ordered off Amazon. You can see here it's super hardy and it's going to fit in with the rest of the van perfectly. Features wise, it's got 2 heads on it, a jet and a shower, so that'll be really handy for doing dishes without using too much water. And the other feature I'm excited about is the extendable head on it. Will reach itself right outside the van, so you'll be able to rinse off your feet before entering, but also be able to use the tap outside. So now to install this should be pretty simple. We've got a mounting bracket for the underside. So all I really need to do is get my hole saw in the right location, and then we can just drop this bad boy in. So looking at the instructions that came with the tap, the hole for this one we want to be between 32 and 38 millimeter. Now luckily, because I spent the money originally to buy a full hole saw kit, we have a 35, which is going to be perfect. I just need to find the central location for the sinkhole. Here's my marking, so let's get that hole drilled in. Yeah, there we go. That will work. So now we have to get that mounting bracket involved, and the order for that is bench top, washer, metal plate, and then I'm just gonna call this a little twisty bit. So we screw that as hard as we can, and then we use the screws to lock it in place finally. My tap is now mounted on the countertop. So the next step is going to be to connect the pull-out hose into the little blue clip here. And that gives us our continuous loop. So now to make this hose retract, we're going to be installing a weight on the inside of this pipe. So with the weight ball here, we disconnect these screws on either side to separate it. And then it's as simple as reattaching that weight on the line where the sticker is. And there we go. We now have a retractable hose. With my sink and tap installed, we can begin working on my plumbing. These ends now will just screw. Oh, that is a solid little connection we got there. The tap into the pump.
Get out of it.